about credibility and why it matters in your writing. So we have been learning about the rhetorical situation and the rhetorical appeals. You've done the rhetorical analysis, and you've talked about how writers and speakers use the three rhetorical appeals of logos, which is facts and figures, statistics, measurable data that we can look up and confirm for ourselves. Pathos, which is the emotional appeal, whether that's joy or anger or love or hope. That's a tool that writers and speakers use to play on or to get or provoke an emotional response from their audience. And lastly, there is ethos, right? Ethos is the appeal to credibility. You want your speakers to believe that your evidence is not only trustworthy, but you as a writer are trustworthy. So we're going to talk a little bit about credibility today and why it matters in your writing. And I have a short, hopefully, presentation here on credibility. And what credibility actually relies upon in your academic writing is attribution of sources. And we do that by using in-text citations. So, of course, we've gone through this before, why it's important to give credit where credit is due. Top of the list there is avoiding plagiarism, right? And you've done that whole plagiarism module, so you should know how to avoid plagiarism. Sometimes it's done accidentally if you're not quite sure how to insert quotations or paraphrasing or summarizing. So I'll talk about that in a minute. And then, of course, you want to establish the credibility of your research, right? You want to let your audience know that the research that you're showing, that the evidence and that the data is reliable, it's trustworthy, it's believable stuff, right? You also give credit to help the reader transition into the essay. Clarify differences between what is information and what is research. Sometimes there's common knowledge that really doesn't need to be cited, but then there's special information and special research that, of course, needs to be cited. You also do it because you want to sound more professional, right? It just helps that you use trustworthy sources. It makes you look better. It makes you seem more credible to your audience. And lastly, you also sorry about that. Use it to protect yourself. And what do I mean by that? Well, it protects you in the event information is incorrect or is upsetting to your reader. You can say, well, I didn't say that. This person here said it. And I prove that by citing from the source. And you can go to the source and see how they said it. That's not necessarily my opinion, but this is something that I have presented. So, of course, when do you give credit? You give credit when you are quoting directly. That means you're using quotation marks. You also give credit when you're paraphrasing the information. Remember, paraphrasing is saying something in your own words, but it's not your original idea. So you have to give credit to the person who had the original idea. And of course, you also give credit when you're summarizing information. That's very helpful when you are retelling a story. It might be a long story. You don't want to use a long phrase, but you know it's not your story, that you're summarizing what somebody else said. So you need to give credit to what that person's original ideas are. So I want to recap here about plagiarism. I know that you've gone through that whole module, so you should know, but I think some of you are still struggling a little bit. So to avoid plagiarism, you have to give credit whenever you use another person's idea, opinion, or theory, any facts, statistics, graphs, drawings, any pieces of information that are not common knowledge. When you quote directly from another person's actual spoken or written words, that's very important there. It's not just things that are written down, but things that are also spoken. You give credit when you paraphrase another person's spoken or written words. So plagiarism includes, but isn't limited to, the intentional use by paraphrase or direct quotation of the published or unpublished work of another person without full and clear acknowledgement. And then you can read the rest of that. This it was actually from a presentation I did when I was teaching at Cincinnati State. So ignore that syllabus link at the bottom. I did not go through and correct that. My apologies. But you can actually look at the course resources and the student resources to learn more about what UC's policy is on academic integrity and how plagiarism is treated. I do it on a case-by-case basis. I usually try to use what seems like plagiarism as a learning opportunity or a teachable moment with students to give them the benefit of the doubt, and they can go back and correct things. But if it's a persistent problem, then I usually will fail a student for an assignment where they have plagiarized and they haven't made amends to what they did wrong, or they don't recognize that they've done anything wrong. So yeah, that's that. So there are different types of plagiarism. There's actually a video, and you can see the link here down at the bottom. I will post that. Just if you're curious, there are different types of plagiarism that students may not realize is actually plagiarism. There is the clone, which is just repeating word for word what somebody else has said without using quotation marks, representing it as your own ideas. Control C, which is actually, the shortcut for copy. And that means it contains significant portions of the text from a single source without alterations. So you may be copying and pasting large parts of the text, skipping over others. And yeah, that's not acceptable. Find and replace means you're changing keywords and phrases, but retaining the essential content of the source. So you may change a few words and you say, oh, well, I'm actually paraphrasing, which is, no, you're not actually paraphrasing. You are just replacing a few words. And that's not acceptable either. A remix, that's paraphrasing from multiple sources that are made to fit together. Again, that's a big no-no. You have to cite each source where that information comes from. You can't just mix it all together and call it your own. The recycle is borrowing generously from the writer's previous work without citation. The hybrid it combines perfectly cited sources with copied passages without citation. So you're citing from some people, and yet you're copying passages and not giving citation for other sources. The mashup, which is similar to the remix and the find and replace, it mixes copied materials from multiple sources. So you may take a sentence from this source and then a sentence from another source and then another sentence and pass it off as your own material. Again, that's a huge no-no. The 404 error will include citations from non-existent or inaccurate information about your sources. So you may just make up stuff and hope to goodness that your instructor doesn't actually check out to see that your sources are legit. I do that. It takes me a long time sometimes to find the original quoted information. But I find that is necessary sometimes to teach students that, hey, this is the original quote and your paraphrase is so very close to this quote that it's not an acceptable paraphrase. As I said, that takes a lot of time, but I think it's a good thing for me to do as an instructor. It's a teachable moment, and hopefully students learn the error of their ways. The ninth one here is aggregator, which includes proper citation to sources, but the paper contains almost no original work. Again, the whole point of writing is to express your original ideas, and then you use sources, you pull in sources, so that you can show that you're not the only person who thinks this way. That's why you use support and evidence. You say, okay, I think this way, but you know what? I'm not alone. There are other people who are very respected in their fields who think this way also. So I'm not, as I said before in a previous video, I'm not a complete wackadoodle. There are other wackadoodles out there who agree with me. And then, of course, there is what we call the retweet, which includes proper citation, but it relies too closely on the text's original wording and or structure. So this is where you think you're paraphrasing because you change out a couple of words, or you leave out a couple of words, or you switch the order of certain words or phrases, but it's really too close for it to be considered a paraphrase. So I will post this link for you. I suggest that you watch it. It's an interesting little video. I think it's under 10 minutes long, just to refresh in your mind and to make you aware that there are various types of plagiarism out there. So many of you have probably seen in my feedback to you that there is a certain way to introduce sources to your readers, right? So the first time that you introduce a source, you need to think of it as like introducing people to each other at a party. You don't just say Joe, right? You say, oh, this is my friend Joe from Mount St. Joseph University, and he is, an entomologist, whatever. But you don't just jump right in, right? You explain to your audience whose ideas you're introducing. You need to make a complete introduction. So your reader will know the source by name and can distinguish sources from each other. So a complete first attribution also establishes the credibility of your source, and it allows the reader to take that information seriously. Oops, sorry. Why do I keep doing that? I'm a ding dong. So you do that by using the author's full name, right? The first name and the last name. Also include their credentials. Why is that author reputable? Why should they be considered a trustworthy source? So, if you're writing about Sherry Turkle, you say psychologist Sherry Turkle, or MIT professor Sherry Turkle, or researcher who in the field of whatever she researches, right? If there's a publication that is more reputable than the author's credentials, then you would use the name of the publication. So, in the New Yorker, so-and-so wrote, or in the New York Times, so-and-so wrote. If you are lacking those first two, which is often the case in articles in a periodical, then use the title of that publication or news service, because it should be a reputable and reliable source of information. So the author's relevant qualifications, you need to be really careful here. Often you'll see in a newspaper or a magazine a byline, which includes a title such as staff writer or reporter or contributor. Those are not relevant qualifications. They're too vague to use as trustworthy credentials. And you can't confirm the relevant qualifications for a periodical contributor. If you can't confirm it, then you don't include it, right? You don't include those relevant qualifications. You're not going to say so-and-so, a staff writer. That means nothing, right? Like, okay, who cares, right? But so-and-so writes in the New York Times, right? We're, again, relying on the reputability of the publication. The New York Times is a very well-known newspaper throughout the world. So it's credible. It may lean one way or the other politically, but we know that it can be a trustworthy source. They don't just publish anybody, right? So also another thing to be aware of is that many people who contribute articles to magazines and newspapers actually have other jobs that are more important than being writers for that publication. So for an example, there might be President Obama may have written an opinion article in the New York Times, right? Who knows? But you're not going to call President Obama New York Times opinion writer. You would say former President Obama wrote in the New York Times, blah, 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 right? Or even just say former President Obama wrote blah, blah, blah. And then of course in your works cited, you would have Obama, comma, Barack, and where that information appeared. So that's very important. Attributing your source for the first time, use the full name and use the credentials. I cannot stress that enough. So here I have some examples of first attribution. According to Dr. Philip Bryant, director of the veterinary medicine program at North Carolina State University, dozens of flying donkeys are born every year. So here we have the author's full name, Dr. Philip Bryant, plus we also have their credentials, director of veterinary medicine program at North Carolina State University. In the next example, according to Jeremy French in a New York Times article, the mayor was on vacation and unaware of the city manager's decision. We may not know who Jeremy French is, but we do know the New York Times. So we're relying more on the credibility of that publication. So we use the title of the publication there. The next one here, we have no author. So we rely on the credibility of the publication. The Akron Beacon Journal reports that the suspect is now in custody and awaits arraignment. So in this case, as I said before, you wouldn't say a staff writer for the Akron Beacon Journal reports, just use the Akron Beacon Journal. We rely on the credibility of that source instead. And then the last one here, we don't have a publication and we don't have an author, so we rely more on the credibility of a well-known news service. According to the Associated Press, the judge will pass sentence sometime next week. So sometimes you'll see in newspapers things with AP source. That AP stands for Associated Press, not advanced placement. The Associated Press is a news service that circulates news to different publications. So you may see an article in several different newspapers that came from this Associated Press source. So here you're just naming the news service. When you do a first attribution for a source, you might sometimes need to trim down the amount of information so you aren't incredibly wordy. That's up to you to decide how much information to leave out and how much to leave in order for your source to appear credible. You can continue to list further qualifications of your source if they're relevant and they establish credibility. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about here is the signal phrase. Now, some of you already know how to do this, but others of you it's a little bit rocky. And this is just something that you learn the more that you write academic papers. So what is a signal phrase? It's a phrase that tells your audience when you, as a writer, are going to paraphrase, summarize, or quote a source. So this is a way that you introduce your audience by using the author's name, or you refer to the source or the research, and then you use an active signal phrase verb that's in the present tense. Without the signal phrase, your readers might have trouble knowing whether the information presented is your original idea or if it's something that's coming from research. So it's important to use a signal phrase and not just plop your quote down and forget about it, right? So here are some examples. Science writer Fred Pierce shows that global warming and hurricane intensity are related. And then we have in parentheses the page number where that information is paraphrased from. So we have in green here, we have the full name of the author, and then we have an active verb here and the paraphrase, and then where we can find that information. Similarly, research in the online magazine New Scientist demonstrates that global warming and hurricane intensity are related. And then in the parenthetical citation, we have the author's last name and the page number. So here we're relying more on the credibility of the publication called New Scientist, and it says the exact same thing here, and yet we have the parenthetical citation of the author's last name and page number because we have a named author. Now, it's important to note here that when you're doing your in-text citations, that your parenthetical citations match up with how your source is listed in the works cited page. I've seen in a few papers that a student will have a signal phrase that uses the author's name and then have a parenthetical citation that has the title of the article in quotes. And there's wrong on a couple of things. If you are mentioning your author in the signal page, there is no need to include the author's name in the parenthetical citation. I allow myself to be distracted with what these two things we're saying here. Also, if you have a named author, you're not going to have the title of the publication in your parenthetical citation. Instead, you would go by author last name. So if you are mentioning the author in your signal phrase, then there's absolutely no need to have that parenthetical citation, since we know that we can look up Pierce in the works cited page and find that information. Does that make sense? I hope. See here in this example, we already have the author named, so we don't have to include it in the parenthetical citation. We do include page numbers when we have them, but since so many of your sources are online materials, you might not have a page number, or if you're looking at a PDF, if it has a page, that's fine. But I've not been particularly picky with the PDFs because most of them have been taken from online, from websites. So hopefully that makes sense. Summarizing and paraphrasing using a signal phrase. Again, you're going to use the author's full name or refer to the research. You use that active signal phrase verb that indicates how the author has conveyed the information. They show, they argue, claim, suggest, so on and so forth. And then after using the author's full name for the first time, the subsequent references should only be by last name. Do not be familiar and call Sherry Turkle Sherry, right? You're not her pal. You don't know her. You refer to her, and this is a particular thing in academic writing, you refer to your source by last name in subsequent references. That maintains a level of formality in your academic writing. And again, if available, you include a page number of the original text in the parentheses at the end of your summary or paraphrase. It's the same with a direct quotation. I'm going to skip over the next couple of slides here. I will post this so that you can look through it at your leisure if you want to. Then how to quote using a signal phrase, again, it's the same way. It's important to note that you shouldn't use really long blocks of quoted material unless you think it's really, really important. And one way you can fix that, say you may like the first sentence and then you want to skip 2 or 3 sentences and you want to quote the last sentence that was in the same paragraph. What you can do there is use ellipses. Now, ellipses are those 3 dots, dot, 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 right? You start the quote with that first sentence, dot, 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 that shows that you're skipping the author's original words, and then end the quote with the end sentence or, you know, whatever information that you're including there. Likewise, you can also use brackets, and brackets indicate that you are inserting text. And we will often do this if we need to change maybe the tense, or we need to add a word or two to make the author's words flow more smoothly with our own words. So you would use a bracket to show that, hey, I've inserted text here. This was not in the original. That's a completely acceptable thing to do. Another thing with quotations, when you're quoting directly, you really want to choose quotes wisely. You want to get the most bang for your buck. And I've written this in some of your feedback on some of the papers. You want to use a quote that is just written so well and conveys your ideas perfectly and supports what you're trying to argue. And the author says it better than you could say it better yourself, right? So choose your quotes wisely. Be judicious, right? You need to judge and make sure that you're not just quoting to fulfill, okay, I had to quote something, so here I've quoted it, and you insert a quote and then you don't say anything more about it. Or you use a long block of quoted material, because that means that's less that you have to write yourself. Students do this. This is a strategy to try to reach a word count. And I'm really more interested in your own original ideas and how you can wisely choose quotes to support those original ideas that you have. I want to know about your ideas, not what so-and-so said, right? So yeah, choose your quotes wisely. Keep in mind, remember, even though mentioning the title of an article in the text of your essay isn't always the best approach, it's not technically wrong, it just sometimes makes the writing more awkward. Also, remember that it is never acceptable to refer to your source by first name only. You refer the last name in subsequent citations. Also, avoid using vague or confusing verbs. For example, an article in the Cincinnati Post says, or the article states. Even though it's technically not wrong, they're just really bland. Articles don't say, state, or report. That's something that people do. Instead, try using the word write if the author is writing, or you can use says if the person in your quote is actually speaking. Some of you have quoted from some TED Talks or YouTube videos, and that's perfectly acceptable. Here is a list of some signal phrase verbs that you can use. The verb to state is actually one of the biggest offenders. It sounds important and official, but in truth, it can be really vague when it's used this way. It would be much more precise to show exactly how the ideas were expressed. So we have a lot of verbs to choose from. Maybe they're arguing, maybe they're conceding, maybe somebody is pointing out something or suggesting. Of course, you would use these verbs in the correct tense. Since the reader of your essay has not read the entire book or article that you're using as a source, you have an important job of showing the reader that you're aware of the tone and intentions of the original source. That is, what is the original context of each quote or idea that you use? When you use better verbs, you are then more specific and convey that original tone or the original intentions of the author, okay? So again, I want you to remind you of the crash course video on quotations and citation, the acronym SWAGG. Remember, S is for stage setting, W is for words, A is for attribution, G is going into detail, and the other G is going forward. So by setting the stage for your quotes, paraphrases, and summaries, you provide context for your readers. Follow up that borrowed information with the proper attribution or citation from your source, and then you provide an explanation of your chosen support material, that is the quote or the paraphrase or summary. Then you make connections to your other ideas and points. This makes the job of reading easier for your audience when you are able to make those connections between the various sources and your own ideas. That makes things much easier on your audience. So there are 4 moves when integrating quotations in research writing. Notice we have the introduce, quote, cite, and connect, and this is similar to SWAGG, right? Notice that the subject and the verb of the sentence with the quotation is often in this part, right? You introduce. A concrete, simple subject and a verb are often the key to making this complex sentence clear. Choose a clear subject. Good choices for the subject include who wrote it. So it would be the author's names or authors, plural, names. Who said it? The character's name if you're writing about a literary source, or how and where it was published. So the type of writing it is, along with the title of the piece or the journal in which it appeared. An article in Journal of International Business Studies argues blah, blah, blah. You use those vivid verbs. Remember to use it in present tense because that is what MLA has asked us to do when we write in present tense. When you quote, paraphrase, or summarize, quotations are used to emphasize distinctive opinion, tone, or style. You use them to analyze rhetorical and literary devices, and we use them to provide a basis for disagreement. And of course, we indicate that with quotation marks as well as a clear citation. If you are quoting more than 5 lines of material that's in your text, it doesn't matter if it's 5 lines in the article, but if when you type it out, it is more than 5 lines, then you need to format that as a block quotation. And you can look that up on Purdue OWL. You should be able to find that in our course resources page. And that just means you indent 1/2 inch the full text and you drop the quotation marks. Paraphrases, you use paraphrasing to emphasize facts rather than opinion and tone or style. Of course, you indicate that with a clear citation. The same with summaries. They're used to emphasize the main ideas rather than the nitty-gritty details of a source, or to provide accepted background information. Again, you use a clear citation with your summaries. Then you cite. MLA citation is designed to provide an unobtrusive way to direct readers to complete bibliographic information so they can look up the source for themselves. So when you do it correctly, your readers will be able to look at your parenthetical citation, go to your works cited list, see that source, and hopefully you have enough information that they can go and look that up themselves. It's a lot easier when there's a URL that takes you to a website where you can look up that information, but at least the title of the source can help somebody to do further research. And that's just a part of that ongoing conversation, right? The ongoing scholarly conversation. So in general, what appears in an MLA style parenthetical citation refers the reader to the first element of the appropriate entry of the list of works cited at the end of the essay. It might be the author's last name, or it might be the title of the article. In general, the parenthetical citation applies only to the sentence in which it appears. And that's why if the sentence ends with the quotation, the period goes after the citation rather than inside the closing quotation mark. Hopefully that makes sense to you. And can you use the citation to find the full bibliographic information from the list of works cited at the end of the paper? That's a question you should always be asking yourself. Am I citing this correctly? So that somebody else reading my paper would be able to find that information in the works cited list. And then connect. How your evidence relates to the main idea might be obvious to you, but it won't be obvious to your reader. So the connection between evidence and conclusion takes some interpretation. And if you don't provide readers some guidance, you risk their interpreting your evidence in a different way and not connecting it to your argument. That's why at least one sentence incorporating important concepts from both your source and your main idea is critical in connecting the two for your reader. So we have kind of like I think some instructors call this like a quote sandwich or an information sandwich. So you introduce it, you provide context, you then have your quote, your citation, and then you have an explanation or a connecting idea there, making connections for your readers. Joining the conversation. So on Twitter, I follow a bunch of writing instructors, and Dan Martin is a scholar, a rhetoric scholar, and a writing program administrator at Central Washington University. And he has some really interesting Twitter things, and he has this one thread that was pinned to his page. And he discusses the beauty of using citation as a means of fostering the conversation between the writer's minds, sometimes across generations. He calls this textual DNA, that each citation style, whether it's MLA, APA, Chicago, they each have a certain rhetorical purpose, and that acts as an entryway into academic conversations. And you can see the link here to that thread. So joining the conversation, and the student concludes, so a works cited or a reference page is about entryways into conversations. I can use it to follow a trail of connected research. Absolutely. And that is just the beauty of being a part of the scholarly conversation, right? Remember, in the scholarly conversation, we are seeing that textual DNA, right? We're seeing where it originated from and how it is branched off into different directions. And then here is my credits page. I have a lot of respect for the people who've done this stuff before me. So there you go, proper attribution of sources. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. That's why I'm here. I will answer your questions to the best of my ability. Take care, everybody, and go on your papers. Bye-bye.